let's talk about Joe Abercrombie, The Last Argument of Kings. This is the last in the First Law trilogy. It is 700 pages long. It's a big boy. I'm going to give a very quick, complete non-spoiler review, even if you've not read the first two books, and then I'll give a non-spoiler review for this book, but with some spoilers for the previous two books, The Blade itself and Before They Are Hanged. So the complete non-spoiler review is this is a mostly satisfying conclusion. The plotting and structure is largely an improvement on the previous books in the series, and the character work continues to be really good. The action is good. The discussion of themes is usually interesting. Unfortunately, the biggest flaw is that one of the major plot threads ends up being structured quite badly. In an overall improved book, you're thinking, oh, well, all these dials are going up, this one goes down. And so that kind of holds it for me around the same quality of the first two. I probably think the first book is just about the best, but only by a small amount. And they're worth reading if you are into the idea, politics and human psychology. So particularly around human psychology, evil, political history, and destiny, themes like that in this kind of slightly gritty, low magic world. So that is the complete non-spoiler. So no spoilers for this book, but spoilers for previous books in the series. What's happening is we have 6 point of view characters, the same from the previous book. We have Logan, Dogman, and West in the north. After Lord Marshal Burr and West's victory over Bethod, they're now going up to where Bethod lives to try to kick him out. And in Adua, you have Jezal and Pharaoh, who have returned from the west, and Glocta, who's returned from Dagoska. And they're kind of stuck in lots of intrigues. So the north is a heavily action-oriented plot, and the centre, Adua, is an intrigue-related plot to do with Bayaz's master plan to save the Union, and the different factions manipulating and blackmailing Glocta, so Valant and Bulk and Archlector Sultan. The fact that this detective is caught in between these two factions, and you also get, in terms of you get Pharaoh in the centre. She is, I guess, still looking for vengeance on the Gurkish. Jezal is a hero now. He's gone. He's won the tournament. He's gone to the west and done this mission. Now he's back and he's increasingly heroic looking. Logan has gone back north, and he's trapped back in his old ways to some degree. He thought he'd escaped himself, and now he is face to face with who he was before. And West just trying to make this kind of stuff work, the war work, and Dogman just trying to get through, just trying to survive with his friends. So that's kind of where we're at. And what should we say about that? The way that plot works for these characters is a lot better overall without compromising their arcs. So the arcs are usually satisfying. What happens to those characters is usually satisfying, and the actual plot is much better. So there might be 80 pages at a time where on every chapter within that something happens. Whereas I think in the previous books you might read 40 pages and find nothing happens significantly. Particularly say in the second book, Before They Are Hanged, that journey to the west where there's like one or two major world building points. The plot, there is a necessary plot conclusion at the end, but it doesn't really matter. The whole thing's kind of a waste of plot space. It's just there so we can see Jezal and Logan and Pharaoh, And that is one thing. Half our characters are there and nothing happens. There's a major problem in the second book. Nothing like that here in terms of waste of space. What there is, though, is a different structural problem to do with Bayaz, because Bayaz is the 7th major character, really the 4th major character after the 3 big POVs. Bayaz is at the centre of the plot. His plans since he met Logan have been unfolding, and what he wants to do to kind of preserve the Union is unfolding, trying to get the seed failing, etc. And that is really interesting, but it is the place where Abercrombie's, maybe his weak plotting still bites and comes in. So, for instance, Malachus Key, we know, is annoyed at Bayaz in the last book. We find out why that is with several large pauses. I think of literally like 100 pages and stuff. We get hints. You think that's a point where it was quite interesting in the previous book. It plainly is going to be something that will come up and be resolved, but it just doesn't get kind of handled particularly quickly or easily. And this is also something with Baez where a couple of times a vital piece of information in our detective work about what's going on to do with him is given more or less as that point resolves, which in detective fiction terms is cheating. You have to give all the details out even if they're distorted, whereas here there's stuff where you're like, well, how would I know that, or why would I expect that to be the case, or why would I connect A and B? There's nothing that you've ever said that would have put me in that direction. And I think that, I think that is interesting because it indicates that that issue of his weak plotting is still there, and it may well improve in future books by him. This obviously, his third book from 15 years ago or whatever. So I'm not, criticising the guy. The points of view themselves are satisfying. They're all characters we have come to understand, if not like. Some, Dogman, West, mostly Logan, we like, I think. Ferro, kind of difficult, but because she's so animalistic. But then you think, well, yeah, but I get it. I get why she cares about the stuff she cares about. Glocta is Glocta for good or ill. Jezzel, I think I've heard people say this before. Jezzel definitely has, in some ways, the most interesting arc from book 1 to 3, and he is increasingly a kind of a top POV in this book. I don't know what you thought about in previous books. I liked him increasingly through those in terms of someone I wanted to read about, and that is, the psychology continues to be good, the stakes continue to be good, characters generally speaking act consistently with their motives, and that works, and that's good, so I don't know what more to say about the character work that Abercrombie does, except that, he can slowly draw out themes and details of characters, and I'll talk a bit about this in a second to do with virtue and vice, but the strengths and weaknesses of these characters and why they do what they do. He slowly draws that out over the 3 books in a way that basically really works, and it means that the conclusions to these characters, whether they get a kind of like, oh, their arc is like this, or their arc is, like this, or their arc is circular or whatever, all these make sense, and all of them feel true to the character and the decisions they made, including at points where they're given very parallel choices. That all works, again, very well. The action and maybe a couple more problems, I should say, just to kind of get those out of the way before getting onto some kind of other stuff. In terms of the writing itself, there is the conclusion itself perhaps is a little bitty and unstructured. The epilogues, and given that Abercrombie structures are thin but not confused, the fact the conclusion feels a bit confused, and I wasn't really sure what was connecting to what, and I sometimes thought, wait a second, I kind of want to go here and find out something here, because I'm not, and some of that might be on purpose, but at the same time, I'm the reader, I get to say at some level what worked, and I think that was something where possibly a bit more space and structure needed given to the epilogues. And this is a small star point in terms of, his style is perfectly functional and good, at points quite good, never really bad. But there's also an issue where the philosophical asides aren't always earned out of the action. In Batman the Animated Series, after an episode of psychological torture by the Scarecrow, Batman comes out, saying to the hallucination of his father, who's saying that he disapproves of Batman. He says, "Oh no, I'm fear. I am the night. I am Batman," and it's earned there. Whereas other times, like "I'm Batman" is not earned. The idea that is a statement of almost existential identity is other times it feels absurd in Batman media, and it's the same here. That's most of the time the punchlines to the events, the philosophical reflections work. But sometimes, and maybe more often than I'd like, well, certainly more often than I'd like, you just feel like, it's a bit heavy-handed. Glocta is particularly guilty of that. In that sense, where Glocta is people's favourites, usually, I wonder whether I didn't get that, I don't feel like that, partly because I sometimes stumbled on the sense of the authorial voice coming most strongly there, and without having earned the punchline, giving me the punchline and conclusion and PSA message to take away. But anyway, the action, the battles, they're good. I think there is an interesting point where Abercrombie focuses on the gore, the horror, the inhumanity of war quite reasonably. That's one, it's a choice, and two, it's certainly a factor in war, isn't it? I think there might be one tension here, and it's not really a criticism, it's just a tension, where, and David Drake is very good on this, if you want a counterpoint, is where, war is hell, but also it is a good thing war is so terrible, or else we should grow fond of it. The idea that war brings camaraderie and it brings excitement. Winston Churchill willingly served in 5 frontline wars, in frontline roles and 5 wars. And you kind of think there's something where that point of view, you see a bit of it, a tiny bit of it with Logan, but only in the context of the Bloody Nine. And you get the camaraderie, particularly with Logan's crew. But there's a thing where you can tell that you wonder whether Abercrombie has reckoned with the fact they're only friends because Logan went around not killing them. You think, well, I think he must do, because he has a subtle view of Logan's character. But whenever there's kind of a grumbling about the needlessness of all these deaths, you think, yeah, well, 3 trees and 40 should have died a long time before. The fact they were brought together into these friendships, not 40, sorry, no, I guess he was in a duel with Logan, but, Tilduru and Black Dow as well. The fact that they are alive and friends is a kind of weird side effect of this terrible thing, and that maybe could have more space given to it in terms of to how war and action are presented. Abercrombie has a very strong philosophical vision of these things, and that is good. Authors are always preaching, so I like them to know that they are preaching, and he's very good at that. But there's some issues of subtlety with that too, I think. So yeah, that's a small criticism, I should say, but the action of war is generally very good, very satisfying. Certainly echoes some Gemmell and other authors, but with a pessimistic twist about how those things work out and what they look like. There are enjoyable new characters. Crummock, the Hillmen chief, who joins Dogman at the start of the book. He's both horrifying and hilarious. At least, he's usually funny. Sometimes there are points where I actually kind of chuckled, and genuinely really enjoyed that character on the whole. And Princess Therese, who we have seen briefly before she was in the first book, engaged to Prince Ladislav, and she is back, and she's kind of hot, energetic and passionate and strong and strange and difficult and also vulnerable, and she's really interesting, and I kind of wanted more space for stuff on her character to develop, and that's one of the conclusions, one of the epilogues, where the sloppiness, what seems like the sloppiness of the epilogue, meant that I didn't get as much there as I might have liked, or I didn't understand as much, or I didn't, it felt like the camera was snatched away too soon, perhaps. Obviously, lots of these things, certainly some of the frustrations are intentional frustrations. Some of these things are things that Abercrombie wants to say, because, as I say, he has a strong philosophical vision. I think that some people sum this up, I think, including Abercrombie, as being in part at least about a debunking of the great man theory of history, that just if someone is strong enough and good enough, they can change things for the better. That's interesting. He's Clausewitzian rather than Germanian, if you want to look at your military theory, I guess. It's interesting. He is good at that, and he's not unnuanced, and I'm going to actually go into this a little bit. This very, very softly might, if you squint, spoil at some points, but not really, so just bear that in mind. He is not unnuanced, but it is a strong theme, and it is something where a lot of things to do with the idea that events are manipulated by at the very least, manipulated by the powerful at the expense of everyone else, and the powerful are only a very few people at most. Now, it's interesting to compare that to Dune, where human destiny and the use of individual people in that and their role is examined quite seriously. And I think it is fair to compare to that in terms of the depth of its philosophical inquiry into the matter. they're not as good books as Dune, what is, but it's certainly there is an attempt to engage with those issues, and the big thing is, there are ineluctable processes that drive you to do things you don't want to do. You get caught between cruelties all the time. You are unable to escape bad decisions, even if you are in some respects powerful. And we see that already with an obvious example is Glocta, who is at the start of the book is caught between a rock and a hard place despite being increasingly powerful. The more powerful he gets, the more he is being pressured. So it gives a view of politics and of human agency, which is in some respects quite pessimistic, quite negative. What you can say, though, is that he opens up the question of whether there are not ways to resist that. He doesn't answer things decisively, it doesn't work like that, but there certainly is a degree to which he says maybe there is an interiority, an interior decision to be better. Remember, we've already heard both Jezzo and Logan speak explicitly in those terms, and Glocta, there is always the thing where a water which often leaks from his twitching eye, water leaks from his twitching eye at an emotional moment, and it's clear that there are massive conscience for all three men which drive them to greater or lesser extents to try to do something else. You see that in book 2 with Glocta and Carlot Dan Ida, and the idea that so that's the thing, rather than a positive seek the beautiful, do the good, there's a bit of that perhaps, but rather than that, perhaps there is a degree to which you can, stricken by conscience, see the evil and flee in horror from it. And that's something which would seem to me to contradict the idea that this is a novel that's pessimistic about human goodness. Equally, maybe there are small ways, and again, this isn't answered decisively, but it's raised. Maybe there are ways, in small and broken ways, you can work within systems in quiet ways to do good. And I think that, again, pushes back against this idea. Look, I mean, the front of this has a review that says it's delightfully twisted and evil, and the back calls it grim. And it's not really, it's grim at points, this book, more than the other two, but it's not a grim book, and it's certainly not an evil book. It's a human book. It's a pro-human book. It is anthrophile rather than misanthropic. It likes people and it wants the best of them, and it finds it frustrating and infuriating that there are these processes that crush people, particularly the small and the weak. And I think those are themes that Abercrombie investigates well, and he does open up the kind of, the various questions around how we deal with them, I think, quite well. So we're all swept along by history. The truly great push us along. The only question is whether there is some small space in which we can resist. And you think of, if you've seen the film V for Vendetta, the letter that V finds in the prison, and this idea that perhaps there is, or Stephen Fry's defiance, the idea, are there ways that you can push back against inhumane and destroying systems? And in these books, if everyone goes down to the mud, it doesn't help them, the people who are dead and maybe just want to live, and Logan's mantra of still alive is interesting, and that is really satisfying, seeing the way in which the many things that either the mantras he's taught himself, or the advice his father has given him over the years, how they work out for him, is actually really interesting and satisfying. The way that different characters react to the same stimuli is really satisfying, and good character work. But if everyone goes down to the mud, and you can't avoid dying, and that's all there is, can you say, when all's said and done, that Forley the Weakest and Rudd Three Trees went down to the mud worse than other men? They went down on their own terms, being entirely who they are, with nothing that compromised their character ultimately. And is that better or worse than X other character, Conrad von Worms or whatever his name was, from book 2? Is that something you can say of all characters? I think it is actually ultimately much more, though it is a pessimistic book in many ways, it's a much more optimistic book than people give it credit for. Also, Niskomo Kosuke, isn't it hilarious that the most loyal man in all these books is the guy who's reputed to constantly betray his employers? Anyway, I think there are a couple of really quite significant structural problems. I think there are a couple of odd tonal issues which are worth criticising. But on the whole, I think this is a good book. It's a good conclusion. I actually have a chapter of Best Served Cold, which apparently people don't really like. But I've got a chapter of that which I will read, and so I will read on in the First Law universe at some point. I think this could be a trilogy that stands the test of time to a limited degree. What by that I mean, I think there are enough problems, and perhaps the tone is so much of our time, of that particular kind of anxious, phantasaical kind of attitude, that people in 70 years' time may find that stuff less attractive. And it's not as structurally and prosaically brilliant as A Lord of the Rings, to state the obvious. So it means that both thematically and formally, there are things which won't age well necessarily. But I think there's enough here to do with human psychology and an honest attempt to grapple with human agency as a theme, that I think that will last well. I think people will enjoy these in 30, 40, 50 years. How they rank compared to other things now that are considered as good or better, how they rank compared to things that are now 30 years old which people don't read anymore, as a point about Gemmell, for instance, I don't know. I think, I don't think it's going to last as well as some of those other things, but it's been a satisfying read, and if, from having heard the reviews I've done of these, it sounds interesting, I would certainly get going with Last Argument of Kings if you've read the first two books. Anyway, tell me what you thought about it. Tell me what you like about the rest of the First Law books. What you'd recommend, what you wouldn't. I'm going to do, I think, a spoiler discussion, probably just of the Blade itself versus Lies of Locke Lamora, not as a war, but as a discussion about some of the themes in those things and the way they look at humanity. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the themes in these books as well. Tell me in the comments. Till next time.